Hey Jenna,
Hey, Dom.
we're back.
We sure are.
I'm always surprised. I feel like I always respond like, "Wow, we're back. Another week."
Well, because I mean, I would say this is impressive that we have managed to hold on and continue. Um, we're almost 10 episodes in.
This is episode 8, right? We're up to episode 8.
Yeah, yeah, this is
Wow.
impressive. I'm impressed with us.
Wow. I'm so impressed with us. Can't
No,
believe we've done
I mean,
this.
listen, we need to virtually high five one another because we have
Wait,
really.
wait a minute. I'm going to do that actually. It's- Where are the
Oh, isn't there
reactions?
something of the reactions?
There we go. I'm
Okay,
giving us a virtual high five, or her
all
virtual
right.
clapping. Applause,
I will
applause.
also. There you go. Now I'm doing it too.
There you go.
We did the damn thing.
There
So,
we
well, we're coming up on having because we're almost at 10. So we've almost done the
almost
damn
there.
thing. All right.
Yes.
So, with
How
that
are
in
you?
mind,
How are you doing though?
I'm doing great. But with that in mind, let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna,
And I'm Dom, and we're both award-winning journalists.
who've recently been laid off.
Our industry is experiencing a seismic shift, and it's shed a lot of really good journalists.
So, where does that leave us? Well, we're definitely laid off.
And we're looking for new jobs, looking for what's left of the industry, and what to do next.
And we're looking at all of it. So if you're a fellow laid off journalist, a working journalist, or someone who admires the craft, we're looking to build community.
Develop new skills, and try to figure out what just happened.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking. I'm doing pretty good.
Good, good. So am I. It's been a week,
Well,
but
I feel like every week has been a week. I mean,
I
again, we're
know.
two people running an entire production here,
And also life going on around you, you know what I mean? It's
and
like
that too.
that's the other part of it is the fact that it's you have this world of dealing with a layoff and looking for work, and then it's not like everything else stops and you just are able to catch up. Life keeps going on, bills come in, and not, and good stuff happens too, you know. But yeah, I'm sure for everybody else out there too, it's the same thing.
Oh, I'm so certain, yes.
Um, so do we want to go dive right into the headlines?
Yeah, I think we've got some pretty interesting. Well, I mean, interesting. I don't even know what anymore. We've got
I know.
headlines.
We
I
got
don't even know what to call it anymore.
I mean, I'm going to, all right. So I'll start with a recent headline during the past week. And now I'm reading this from CNN. Um, and it's basically Deadline's entire staff has been laid off after the sports site was sold to a startup. So for people who don't know, Deadspin, and actually, I feel like you know a lot more about Deadspin than I mean. I've heard of it. I didn't visit it regularly, but I have heard of it. I know they've done a lot of really good journalism. Um, but uh, do you want
Sports
to?
journalism. If you're
Yeah,
like,
do you want
yes.
to?
So basically what it was is they were obviously an online website that did sports journalism, but they tended to offer a critical eye of not just sports itself, but also the business of sports. Like, stories about the way the NCAA operated or some of the problems within excuse me, the many problems with the NFL and the way that players were treated, player contracts, all sorts of things. Yes, also been criticized for some of their other coverage. Most recently, the story of the kid who was the Chiefs fan with his face painted comes to mind, which I believe the family is actually suing because basically
Mhm.
what happened was there was I don't know, like a little boy, maybe 9, 10 years old, was at one of the Chiefs games, and he had his face painted half red, half black for the team colors, and they used a picture of the side of his face painted in black and implied that he was in blackface. And that was not the case at all. And so, of course, that family rightly so pushed back, but still there was a lot of, I mean, they did articles about how race factors into the way that we view athletes and how we treat sports and athletes, etc., and how differently we treat white athletes when they achieve half as much as some black athletes do. And the way that we come down harder on black athletes for making some of the same mistakes or unfortunately just horrific offenses that white athletes do. Like a lot of that reporting, you know, Deadspin did, and they're gone. Sports Illustrated
Well,
is gone. Like,
yeah. Yeah, they sold basically the CEO put out I guess a memo to the staffers saying that the company had been sold to another company, but in basically that company is laying off all the entire staff, and I guess they're changing the brand. So um unfortunately that's happened. Another story actually is about now this was first reported in on the site which is a blog.
mm-hmm,
It's started by veteran journalist Richard Prince,
mm-hmm.
and it reports on diversity issues in the news media. The headline was J Group says hedge fund papers unwelcome. I'm reading directly from Isaiah Jerome Lewis Poole's article, which says Report for America, which is uh, an organization that sends journalists to shrinking newsrooms, is phasing out its relationships with hedge fund owned properties. It says Kim Kleeman, um, executive director of Report for America, confirmed the decision during comments at a journalism's roundtable on the state of the news industry on February 27th. Uh, it's so what they're what they're saying here is they're choosing not to work with organizations um that are
Owned and
what new
operated by hedge
by
funds, where
yeah.
people who are in the business to make money and not tell stories or do journalism are calling the shots, is what it's sounding like to me.
Yeah, it says Kleeman said its current cohort includes reporters on 198 partner news organizations. Of those, 11 are part of the now hedge fund owned Gannett chain, the largest in the country, and one McClatchy. And they're saying, yeah, they're choosing not to work with those. They won't be eligible to participate as partners. Um, and it says, Kleeman says, we started at Report for America working with what are now hedge fund owned organizations because we consider ourselves as supporting communities. And sometimes those newsrooms owned by those companies, were the only game in town. Um, but they're looking at the fact that they have to start confronting these issues of these hedge fund owned companies and what the impact I guess that they have or have been having on the industry in terms of layoffs. So um yeah, and that kind of actually feeds into our conversation that we are going to be having with Margot Susca, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Margot, she is, amongst many other things, a PhD. She's a inaugural assistant professor of journalism, accountability, and democracy at American University's School of Communication. But she also is author of the book Hedged, and we had a chance to have a in-depth conversation with her about how her book put it, private investment funds help destroy American newspapers and undermine democracy. That's a big indictment, but she's got the goods to back it up. Welcome, Margot.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, one of the things I thought was so great was when you started out the book, you mentioned that you started this book to answer a question that you couldn't, which is almost exactly what Dom and I are doing. So, just to start off with, what was the question that you wanted to answer?
So I was doing an interview in late 2017 with the NBC News Think program, and the producer, Christine Wynn, asked me about, it was not long after the FCC had rolled back media ownership rules. And she asked me, how did I know that, these theoreticals that I were talking about, media consolidation, how did I know that it was as bad for democracy as I kept saying? And I had studied media ownership in my doctoral program. I had been a witness to an ever shrinking number of media owners when I had worked as a newspaper reporter. Although I was lucky, I worked for a Scripps Howard newspaper chain, and we were kind of flush with HGTV money at the time. So when I began researching, newspaper layoffs was one of the things that I was really interested in. I was really kind of interested in answering this question that I didn't really know the answer to, which was her saying, well, how did you really know it was bad for democracy? And I really couldn't answer her in that moment. I had a sense that it was bad, but what did I really know? And it kind of started what ended up being a multi-year journey, and it ended up being ultimately an investigation of the hedge funds that own newspaper chains and the private equity firms that invested in newspaper chains, including before the 2008 Great Recession, which I think is often an overlooked part of the conversation about the destruction of US newspapers.
Of course. There's a quote that stood out to me and Dom, but Dom, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, at the beginning of your book, you started with a quote from Ida Tarbell's book, the 1904 book, The History of the Standard Oil Company. And the quote that is, its business has come to be a legitimate excuse for hard dealing, sly tricks. I'm sorry, sly, I lost my place here.
That's okay.
It's for hard dealing, sly tricks, special privileges. It is a common enough thing to hear men arguing that the ordinary laws of morality do not apply in business. Um, Number one, why did you choose that quote? And also, I found it fascinating. I did a sort of deep dive then into Ida Tarbell and looking at what she actually accomplished in 1904 through her study of the oil business.
Well, I mean, that's a shout out, I think, to not only to, the muckraking period of, early 20th century investigative journalism and, calling out, of course, a legendary early investigative journalist, not to say that I'm by any means Ida Tarbell, but, I think partly why I called out or used that Ida Tarbell quote is that there is a scholar. She just retired from Northwestern, but really built her career at the University of North Carolina, doing the news deserts research, Penelope Muse Abernathy. And her work, she has called the hedge funds and private equity firms the media barons of the 21st century. And so in looking at Ida Tarbell's work and considering the robber barons of kind of the industrial age, I was really thinking about, kind of this connection between, these railroad magnates and the industrial, kind of, these people who built really the early United States into what it was,
Mm-hmm.
really the working conditions that were created for the lower classes, I think, or for kind of the regular folks, in many cases were terrible conditions. And I think that's kind of what's happening today when we look at private equity firms and hedge funds. There is a certain reverence for Wall Street in the United States today that leaves out a large part of the conversation about how destructive many of those, many, I don't know how to say this in a way, but I think that we look up to billionaires as this aspiration, many parts of the United States, people like Blackstone and BlackRock, people who, are these firms that are run by men who make $125 million a year, when 20% of people live below the poverty line. That to me is an astounding failure of a system. That is a failure of a system, that you have that kind of wealth inequality in the United States, and wealth inequality that's growing. And especially when so many of the people who are in poverty are children. I
Mm.
don't know how that system is, allowed to perpetuate and fester and grow. And when you see investigations like what the New York Times did last year on the number of children, often migrant children, working in food service, companies, overnight with unsanitary conditions. So to me, the reason I chose that quote is now we see that wealth infecting not just industry, but we see it infecting the news industry, the one institution that should be a watchdog on all others. And that to me is really, I think, the kind of bottom line or the thread of my work is that is such a troubling reality of where we stand in the United States today, is that, wealth inequality or, these robber barons have been part of
Hmm.
American society, the exploitation of human labor as long as we've had, enslaved people. I mean, this is not something new in American society. We've seen these exploitations and wealth inequality and, now it's migrant labor. I mean, it's here. But now we see this infection of wealth dominating American news. And what will happen if we can't get back, or we can't have a news system that's independent of that wealth? That's what worries me. And so that's a very long answer to your very perceptive question about why I chose that Ida Tarbell quote.
Well, it's interesting in listening to you talk just about the wealth inequality and who it affects and how few it helps. That I guess just to me, the first thing that came to mind was, didn't Tupac say that in the 90s?
Now, I would have to ask my daughter. She's the expert, more of an expert. I was listening to the Grateful Dead in the 1990s. I don't know. I could barely tell you a lyric from
Well,
one song.
listen, that's not even the point though. What I'm more interested in though is from your research, how did uh these investment firms, how do they come into the newspaper industry and just start taking over? Like, how did that even happen so quickly? Because it seemed like it wasn't a thing, and then suddenly they were everywhere.
Well, so here's the thing is that I think that, so I studied a 20-year period, really from 2003 to 2022. And the reason, private equity was in the newspaper market really going back to the late 1970s. And I didn't choose to start at that time because I didn't think it was as notable, because it was a little bit of they were quiet. They were there as, as investors during a time when newspapers were very profitable. So they were there as, as shareholders at a time when newspapers were making a lot of money. So, advertising revenue for newspapers in this, in the 80s I had one former South Florida Sun Sentinel editor tell me the only way we could have made more money in the 1980s is if our printing presses had printed $10 bills. Like, it was, newspapers were so profitable. Many had monopolies on their advertising in their communities, whether that was the Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale or the Hartford Courant in Hartford. So there were very profitable newspapers in communities all over. Sometimes even they may have had two newspaper cities. You had a morning and an afternoon, but there was enough advertising to split those and enough readers to split those.
Mm-hmm.
So these private investment funds were happy, pleased. I mean, fat cats making 25%, 30% investment for every dollar that they put in. That's a sizable return. Now, remember, in 2000, there was this dot-com bubble. 2002, there was a little bit of a sag after the 9/11 attacks, a little
Mm-hmm.
mini recession. And there were some signs that the digital transition was coming. So private equity investors start putting some pressure on newspaper chain owners. What's going to happen? And they don't choose digital as the strategy to move forward. Although there were a lot of people that said, you'd better start thinking about this thing called the internet. But they looked at the dot-com bubble bursting and they said, well, why would we put our money there? In Tribune bankruptcy documents, Tribune executives, after they'd been purchased by Sam Zell, a private equity billionaire, he said, he said, if anybody wants to move to digital, this is in 2007. He said, fire them. Our money's in print. And this was one of the most important newspaper chains in the country. So what they chose as a strategy was mergers and acquisitions. we're going to get bigger. We're going to have these things they called synergies. So we'll have one head of operations instead of two. We're going to just buy up as many, newspapers as we can all over the country. And we're going to acquire. So you saw like Knight Ridder merge with McClatchy, Gatehouse, which was effectively an arm of the New York private investment fund called Fortress, just gobbled up hundreds of newspapers. And then you got into a situation where there was a Great Recession and the market just went, the advertising market did bottom out. But then by then you had newspapers that were in debt, in some, hundreds of millions. In the case of the McClatchy Knight Ridder deal, I think was worth $1 billion off the top of my head. And then that was disastrous. So then you had another wave of private equity investors come in who were specialists in distressed debt. And that attracted eventually hedge funds like Alden Global Capital, who some of your listeners may be familiar with because they're like, the vulture that everybody wants to talk about. But there were others, and there's a very small group that kind of, they're in the market. And, when you read as much as I did for the research for the book, there's a very small group that kind of are in the market. But, investing in the debt of a company like Chatham Asset Management invested in the debt of McClatchy after in the 2010. So investing in the debt of a company, Alden investing in the debt of Tribune, and then becoming an owner. Those are two different things. Those are playing two different sports. So what you see is then they become owners, and then you see mass layoffs because all they're interested in doing is making money. A hedge fund doesn't know how to run a newspaper company, nor do they care about running a newspaper company. And that's what's really sad about the current state of affairs. Their interest is maximizing their bottom line, and they don't care about, they care about money. That is it. That is the definition, basic textbook definition of a hedge fund or a private equity firm. And they'll do anything to make it. That's I mean, I read about them for 3 years, and those are my Cliff Notes versions. That's it. I'll save everybody. They don't have to read all the books on my shelf behind me. I'll save you the time.
They'll do anything to make the money.
That's it.
So when these firms take over, though, I mean, the thing is, what's the impact on local journalism overall? Because I think a lot of people will just say, well, if you're not aware of this, you don't, it's not grabbing the headline. So you sort of wonder, well, okay, these things happen, and you're not really aware of the process of what these firms are doing and the impact that it actually has on local journalism.
Well, I think there are, I would say it's almost a tiered impact. So I would say there's an impact on the news itself. And if you were a print subscriber, the impact is obviously a smaller paper. And, if there is a paper, I interviewed for the book 85 current and former newspaper subscribers. And of those, it was so fascinating to me how many hung on to their newspaper subscriptions before they finally said we couldn't anymore. And the newspaper was physically smaller. It had less news. Literally, people would say, and these were people from 24 US states, and they said, it would have one in the front section, one local story. The local section would have one local story. And they were paying between $400 and $700 a year. That's a pretty significant outlay to get one or two local stories a year. A sports section that covered nothing, no local sports, no little league, no high school football, which used to be a big driver of, at least when I worked in Florida at a newspaper, that was a big driver of people's, subscription. So the paper would get physically smaller, and there was less local news. So that's one byproduct of this system. There are fewer reporters to cover it. And I tell the story in the book of one of my former students took my old education reporting job in Florida. When I was there, it was a Scripps Howard paper. It's now owned by Gannett. And it's the area roughly the size of Rhode Island. There used to be 3 education reporters. I covered a district with 40,000 children. It was the largest employer of the county, the school district. So the largest employer. It was under a federal desegregation order for years, plagued by achievement problems. It just was, there are so many stories. I had done investigations, features, you just name it.
Mm-hmm.
And a reporter I trained at American University took that job a little more than 10 years after I left. And she was now, so there were 3 of us covering education when I left to get a doctorate. And the reporter I trained at American University took that job as the only reporter doing the job. So it used to be 3, now there's 1. So she's now covering 3 counties,
Okay.
the size of Rhode Island. And you can be, the best journalist, but you're never going to cover, in a region with migrant children in Immokalee, Florida, Spanish speaking, teacher retention, all
Mm-hmm.
of these issues, So that's one issue, right? Is the paper is smaller, the coverage is less. The other issue that then I would say the tier down from that, to answer your question, is where do those people then go once they decide to quit their paper? If they decide, if there isn't another outlet for them, a reputable, let's say, nonprofit news outlet, and although they're growing, they're never going to be a one-to-one comparison. There are great nonprofit outlets that should get support, but not every community has them. I was just talking to someone about El Nuevo Herald in Miami, which has been gutted by its hedge fund owner. So according to the person I was interviewing, a lot of Spanish speakers in Miami-Dade have cut their El Nuevo Herald subscription and are now turning to AM radio to fill the void. And AM radio is a wasteland of misinformation and right-wing conspiracy theories. Moving into the 2024 election in Florida, that is, that should be, that's troubling. That is, having a strong local newspaper is good for local issues, but there is other research. It's not my research, but as local newspapers disappear, political polarization increases, voter apathy increases. There's more research that suggests the loss of a local newspaper has consequences for democratic consequences.
No, that makes perfect sense. When people now, I think, look at our political landscape and wonder, how did we get here? That explanation of loss of local papers, people turn to other resources. And if AM radio is a popular source, well, then that leads us to this particular quagmire that we're in now.
Yeah.
It's
But
like
I
when
do want to.
it's like when I'm sorry. I was
No,
just going to
Don, what
say
were
it's
you going
sort
to
of
say?
it's sort of like when, opinion or commentary becomes news or it becomes confused
Mm-hmm.
with being news as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to it isn't. And because there are 2 very different, so people then just say, well, okay, this is what I'm getting as news, but it really isn't. And nobody is really, I guess, for many of us, it can be just like you just hear what you want to hear sometimes or something that grabs your attention.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. But I also think there used to be some common ground that local news provided. I think if you, I don't know. And listen, I don't mean to look at local newspapers. I think that as if they were this, look back on them as if I'm looking back on this Shangri-La of, there were issues with,
Mhm.
there were issues with, even in the best of times, drawing in really white suburban audiences that advertisers were trying to draw in. But recognizing that now as a scholar of journalism and society in the year 2024, we would have come to that point through other, through the realization of other, historical progress that we've made. And I think that we could have used, the system that we had to right and correct some of those wrongs. But now that we have, made progress in certain other areas and our newspaper system has been decimated, so I don't mean to suggest that we had always had that newspapers were always doing the best that they could for everything. But I will tell you, and I wrote about this in the book, the Hartford Courant, I grew up in Connecticut and I started writing for the Hartford Courant student section, wrote a couple pieces when I was 14, and I was outraged that there were budget cuts that cut the library hours. And my parents, my dad was a union guy, my mom was a secretary. My parents said, write for the paper, write something for the Hartford Courant student section. And I did, because I believed that the outlet was news. It was the way to make change. That's the house, the kind of house I grew up in. And, but the Hartford Courant, and I was remembering this on the phone with Glenn Smith, now the investigations editor, Pulitzer Prize winning investigations editor at the Post and Courier in South Carolina, who also grew up in Connecticut. And we were talking about the Hartford Courant's series, I think it was in 1992, called Streets of Despair, which was about Hartford's competing crises of addiction, AIDS, and kind of homelessness. And it was this period of time when the Hartford Courant really took a stand to be, it was photo driven, and it was really, it was one of the most powerful series I remember reading as a teenager. And it led to widespread reform, not just in Connecticut, about the way addiction was handled and about the way treatment was handled, but it actually changed the way policy was created in other places. That newsroom where that series was designed is gone. It doesn't exist anymore. It was sold off by Tribune, and now a hedge fund owns that newspaper. So, I can recognize that newspapers historically have failed certain communities, but I also recognize that it was the best system we had, and we could have built on it. And, so that's, I just want to make, I think that's an important point to make. And, I just wanted to make that point. That's all.
No, well, speaking of important points to make, and going back to, hedge fund managers will do anything to make sure that they make the money. But in your book, you do point out that it wasn't just the 80s. Like, newspapers weren't a bad investment. They were making profit. And yet still you had this wide disparity between the profits that some papers were pulling in and the salaries that some journalists were taking home.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I have students, because I teach journalism, I hear some salaries that that some students come to me and say that they're going to make in the journalism market. And I had a student in the last few years come to me, and she said, I got my dream job offer. And it wasn't a hedge fund newsroom, but she had my dream job offer. It was at a place in New Jersey, not far from New York. So consider that market,
Okay.
and it was under $20,000 a year. And so she said, this is my dream job. But she said, God, I really can't afford it. And I said, but it stops being your dream job when you cannot live on that salary. But I wrote about, I interviewed a person, a reporter at the East Bay Times, which is owned by Alden Global Capital. And he, talked about, they won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the Ghost Ship fire, a devastating fire that killed 36 people in a warehouse in Oakland, California. And not long after, layoffs happened. And they were doing important work on how, these people were allowed to live, and, how live illegally in this space, and how the owners were, allowed to, skirt regulation. I mean, doing all the work that journalists should do. And, but he had talked about, the reporter that I interviewed was on the record. His name is George Kelly. My understanding is he's not at the East Bay Times anymore. But he talked about having young reporters hired at that paper. Again, you're talking about the Bay Area, right? One of the most expensive areas in the country, having to live in, rent out people's sheds, like sheds in people's yards to be able to afford the cost of living. I mean, that's no way to do it. Now, remember, according to Ken Doctor's reporting, I think he reported it for Neiman, in 2017, Alden pulled in 170 million in profits from its ownership of the Media News Group chain. So yeah, this idea that newspapers are this dead, tired business, they are still pulling in, they were in 2021, 20 billion between circulation and advertising revenue. That is, that puts a lot of other sectors to shame. But what they're doing now is just a complete liquidation. It's almost like to quote Arrested Development, a fire sale. I mean, it's just they're just going to sell off the assets. They're going to lay off the reporters who are left. And Report for America this week said that it wouldn't send its journalists into those newsrooms, and I celebrated that. I think that that's a long overdue, and it's just not sustainable. You can't keep rewarding the news organizations and the companies that created those conditions with young, hungry reporters. You're just repeating the same cycle. I mean, that's the way I view it. And, I spent 3 years looking through their business records, and I just, and I still meet people, and I interviewed for the book people who said, I still subscribe to newspapers because I want to help pay for reporters' salaries. And I just don't see any evidence that that money, this is not trickle down economics. I mean, they're paying a very paltry salary to reporters. They're paying themselves, dividends whenever they can. Gannett's CEO, Michael Reed, who was a longtime Gatehouse executive, so paid by Fortress Investment Group through a tangled web of, holding companies, and, in years that, he's gotten executive bonuses in years, between 500,000 and compensation packages up to 7.7 million. So it's never about quality journalism. It's always about shareholder value. It's always about Wall Street, and it has been for 20 years. And I'm sorry to say, maybe it's time to let it all burn down.
Margot, it's so interesting because we know it's about money, about profits. It's business for a number of these organizations. But when you have more news deserts, less journalists, or you have a journalist who's covering, as you said before, multiple locations. Like before, it was like maybe one town. Now you're covering 3-4 towns. There's less oversight in government. And I wonder too, and I don't want to sound too, but it just feels this way. Is there also an interest, but some of these corporations, that there is less oversight? Is there?
Listen, it is a point that I make in the conclusion, and I don't think that I make that point strongly enough. I kind of, and I wish that I had really focused on that, which is, that to me, I think is something that I want to look into more, because I think that is, you now have, since Citizens United, and this is kind of the way I frame it in the book, you have almost a political system where money talks more than it, and again, it always has, and money has been a part of journalism since Ben Franklin's days owning Philadelphia newspapers. But Citizens United really opened up new avenues for money to influence politics. Here in Washington, the revolving door, as it's called, this this circuit between working for a regulatory agency or working as a legislative staffer and then going to industry, that's an issue. It gets tracked, and it's becoming, I think, you work on the Hill in order to get a lucrative job working for an industry person is what it seems like. So now, the money in politics is there. You have a news system that's run by these also the wealthy. Wealth is in politics. So there is an incentive for these firms to control the media, to either, and I don't really think it's necessarily to control the narrative as much as it's to just stop the narrative. Why would you want anyone looking into your business dealings or looking into your political money when you have hands in nursing homes, hospitals, cell phone? You're also trying to get, immigration policy maybe changed because you need workers in certain areas. I think increasingly that is part of it. And, and then you have the case of Chevron, which owns a news, and I put that in quotation marks, it owns a news organization in California where it operates a refinery. So again, when you were talking about the void left behind, it's run, I can't even believe, so it's like, I actually don't know, do people actually read that site and think of it as a local news site? You're never going to see an OSHA report about alleged violations, if there were violations there. But so that's where we are, now.
Mm-hmm.
It just is shocking to me that this is the state of affairs. But yeah, there's a vested interest in having what used to be a lapdog press, which is having positive stories. Now it's having, I think, a nothing press.
Well, I also wonder, because you did talk about how there was a decision on the part of at least some investors that we're just going to keep consolidating and buying more papers, and we're not going to pivot to digital. And now, of course, we live in the digital age. Like, as I was going through your book in my head already, I'm like, oh, here's how I can present this in social media form, because if it's not in social media, did it happen? My point is this. Do you think that people turning more and more and more to social media, and by that I mean in some cases if there's no local newspaper but there's a Facebook group that's talking about local stuff, is that filling the void? Because I am seeing those pop up, so there's clearly a need and a desire to know what's going on in your neighborhood. But again, this is just people writing, what they think they saw or kind of remember. It's not really verified in a chat room, effectively, on a social media platform.
Well, I think certainly it's filling a void, but I think, I'm on Facebook so little, now, and I think that Facebook, you know, can be a great need, can be a great source. My stepfather died last week, and I went on Facebook. It was the first place I went because so many of my friends from high school are there, and I wanted to let them know. It was a way to get in touch with as many of my friends from high school in one place to say, hey, letting all of you know. And so I think that's kind of how I think of Facebook. But as a place for people to gather about local stuff, because it just so quickly dissolves into just chaos, right? Even I even had someone I posted to a group when I was trying to recruit people to interview for the book, former journalists for the book. And somebody posted a couple of weeks ago to this site an excerpt from my book that Neiman had posted. And they said, this was written by a former journalist, now a professor. And I went onto the site and said, hey, that's me. I'm the former journalist and professor. And I posted a link to a Q&A I had done with Politico. And I had a few very positive interactions. And then this one person said, I'm offended by what you are saying. And I was like, you haven't even read the book. Like, I know you haven't read the book because you've just gotten on this thread, man. Like, so I see your question, and I think it's such an interesting point that you're making, but like Facebook to me, next door to me is not the space, because all of us have seen, it's like, I don't know what the over under is or the plus or minus or how you say it, within how many comments it takes to go from like, has anybody seen, what the construction is on the corner of, 6th and Spring Street? And then it's like, there might be a few comments, and then guarantee you it's within 6, it goes from that people to just chaos, right? To somebody being like, I hope it's not those people moving. I mean, right? I mean, it, everybody could see.
Yeah, no, it devolves very quickly sometimes. But it does seem to, at least I am in the Hudson Valley of New York, and while we are not completely bereft of local news coverage, I do see more and more the local town Facebook groups becoming the go-to place for information.
Do you have like influencers in those? Are there people who you would consider in those pages or in those I don't know what the right word is, but like trusted? Is somebody like, oh well,
Well,
there's
there's moderators, people who are, like
moderators,
no selling, your whatever it is, etc.
Mhm.
And things of that nature, like they definitely, I would say, at least for the ones that I'm a part of, do a good job on tamping down on the overt racism, etc. But at the same time, um, I just wonder if sometimes people say, oh, people don't want to read newspapers anymore. They aren't interested in that anymore. And I'm saying, well, no, they are. And because there's this
Oh,
void
I
in the
see.
physical form, they seem
Yeah,
to be trying to seek it out in a digital space. People
yeah,
still want, like, I mean, listen,
yeah.
road
I see.
construction around here is an issue people need heads up on.
Yeah.
Things of that nature. But at the same time, I do want to circle back to the book and ask, because at one point you wrote, and I want to make sure that I get this quote correct. Okay. My focus in this book on private investment funds history and rise in the newspaper industry also considers something even bleaker than just their ownership and power. It considers the scorched earth they leave behind and what it means for the future of news and information in American democracy. So, the question I want to pose to you is, do you see a way back, or what, in your opinion, is the way back from that scorched earth that's been left behind?
Well, I think what's happened since I finished the book is that there's been an increase in the number of nonprofit news outlets. And there also have been an increase in the number of independent outlets. You have URL Media in Queens, New York, which I think it doesn't have to be a nonprofit. I'm happy if it's an independent. So I think that those are helping to fill the void. And I think when I look at the future, I think one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my mind around is a much more fragmented future. And what I mean by that is, you know, the news outlets that my 13-year-old daughter will read, even here in Washington, D.C., might be different than the ones that her friends read when she's in college, or that I read. Now, I think that that's going to be a really interesting, and I hope that there will be growth in the nonprofit sector. Certainly the Press Forward initiative that was announced got a lot of attention, this $500 million infusion into local journalism over the next 5 years. There have been some questions about some of its transparency. Is it going to include money they've already given? Some
Mm-hmm.
questions about that. But I think when I say this fragmentation and what I mentioned, let's say you have 10 people and they're all reading different news outlets in the Hudson Valley or in Washington, D.C., or in Minneapolis or in the Bay Area. One of the things that I'm considering is, even if they're all doing investigative journalism, is that going to generate the same pressure on politicians that, an Orlando Sentinel investigation would have generated 15 years ago? And as a researcher, these are the things that I'm really interested in. You know, ProPublica's investigation of babies born in Tennessee, you know, under these new, you know, heavily, you know, under these new abortion bans. As I was reading the story, I'm thinking, is this going to change anything? Is it going to put the same pressure that, you know, this kind of story could have put had we had this overturned 25 years ago, and there it had been done by an outlet that was read by 10 times as many people? So these are the kinds of questions that as a researcher, I'm starting to think about and ask, you know, kind of ask, and how do we measure that? How do we move ahead? And then I think all of us are looking at the 2024 election. You know, when I was reading the coverage of Trump's, I guess, victory speech at Mar-a-Lago last night, this morning in the New York Times, you know, he's already trying to delegitimize the results of an election that he could potentially win. You know, and that's going to have implications for journalism. That's going to have implications for democracy. And you know, I mean, there's just so much that's going to happen between now and November, and so much that could happen after November. But I hope that answers your question. So, but I think we have to look at an audience that's going to be so much more fragmented. And, you know, I think social media is going to take a much larger role. I think TikTok and in those kind of micro sites, I don't, it's probably not the right word, are going to have a much larger focus, you know, influencers in the journalism market. But I mean, I think that means that audiences are going to be getting, you know, these kind of snacks rather than full meals. And I don't know what that means for civic information. I think that might mean the potential for more misinformation, more disinformation, more, you know, I don't know. I always see things as like, oh God, that's potentially so terrible. And then I try to think of, oh, well, you know,
Well,
I was like,
I will say, as a shamefully regular consumer of social media, especially the video form, some of the platforms do seem to be extending the amount of time that people can engage with, because some people would say, yes, you can tell a whole story in 60 seconds. I'm older, so I would say, no, you can't. There's no room for nuance in a minute, but that is my opinion. But yeah, there seems to be an increase as more and more people go to platforms again, like a TikTok or, you know, Instagram Reels, etc., for their information. You can post longer form content. Not a whole lot, but it has seemed to be getting longer.
yeah,
But with the
I finally put TikTok on my phone. I finally, and so I don't actually, you know, but so I finally just broke down and at least got the app. But you know, and I don't mean to sound like I'm disparaging it. I mean, if it's going to engage, you know, I mean, if it's going to be a way in, you know, and my students always say, well, why can't we do both? Why can't we do like Humans of New York and find a way to read, you know, read a long form narrative? You know, I mean, I love a good Real Housewives of Salt Lake City, and I'm also going to read The Nation, you know, I mean, so that's,
I was gonna
yeah,
say, you just became Dom's favorite person.
yeah, I'm going to bring the receipts. I mean, I'll do it, you know, all of
receipts, proof, timeline, everything. Yes.
it. So,
You know, I think that's the thing too, what I hope um is that it can bring both along. I think right now it feels like it's so much on one end in terms of it's blown up so fast that we have to sort of see where it settles. And I've noticed even like, well, you know, they're very different in terms of the news, but there was on TikTok Risa Tisa who did these over 50-part series on TikTok,
mm,
over 8 hours of video that people did watch. And, you know, so I think that people will come if they sort of are attracted to the right, if you know what I mean, like maybe getting into that mode where they do have that, they have the content that they fall into because right now, I mean, you look at TikTok, that's what appealed to everyone at the beginning. It was like, oh, it's quick, it's fast, and I just get this in small little increments. But it is trying to also hope that people do. I mean, like, as Jenna and I, we love, as journalists, we love to dig into a story. You know, we
Yeah.
love to ask questions aside from what somebody presents to me or to us. You look in and say, okay, but let me just see, what did someone else say about this very same story, so that that's what I hope people get, is to be curious. Do you know, one thing I did want to ask, you mentioned this earlier about, um, it was the whole issue of when you were working on this project for this book, that there were some journalists who were not supportive in terms of you writing this book, feeling that it would negatively impact journalism industry. How,
It was very
what,
early. I don't, and I
what,
haven't talked to him since. I don't know what he thinks, but it was one person.
oh, it's one
Yeah.
person? Okay. What do you
Yeah.
think? So what do you think, why, do you think that's something other that people could see, why the negative, what could be, what's the negative impact about what you're discussing here?
Well, I think that, and I think it's a really important question, and when I was hired, so I've been at American University for a little more than 10 years. And when I was hired, so I'm kind of part journalist, but part journalism critic. So it's kind of like kind of like a, maybe one of those theater masks. I'm like half happy, half sad,
Yeah.
and, I'm always the one at the table that's like, but have you thought about this,
Yes.
Um, and I think that, with this round of layoffs, the public radio station that American University operates and owns just laid off 15 people. And, I was one of, on Twitter was criticizing that decision. Um, and it's really a tough time, but I think that it's almost like being anti-war. Would I imagine being against the Vietnam War but not being against the troops?
Mhm.
I feel like I can be critical of a system that has these private equity firms and hedge funds entrenched in it, but recognize that that system produced the Indianapolis Star's reporting on Larry Nasser, and my point is, if we didn't have a system as entrenched in those funds, maybe we would have had 10 stories like the Larry Nasser stories. And the reporter who I had once worked with at Scripps Howard said, um, it's going to come off as you being critical of the journalists who work in those newsrooms. And a good friend of mine who was once had become, kind of was a rising star at Gannett and has since left, but said, you should just be sure to mention, that these reporters are working day in and day out. And I thought that she had made a good point. And I think I in the introduction tried to bring that up, which is, I respect these journalists who, some of whom I know who are still in the newsroom that I used to work in, that was owned by Scripps Howard and then was owned by Journal Register and is now owned by Gannett. I mean, I've known them for more than 20 years. And every day they go in, not to the newsroom I worked in because it's sold off because it was an asset. Every day they go in and try to fight the good fight. They try to do work that is going to, hold some local politician, school board member, or, mayor accountable. And I have a great deal of respect that they still do that. And I wouldn't criticize them. I mean, I'm trying to criticize the structure. So I think that's what I was, I wouldn't want anyone to think I was critical of these journalists, but when I was hired at American University for this job that I'm in now in 2020, one of the questions I asked the committee was, I want you to really think about what it means having me on your faculty in this role,
Hmm.
because this role means I'm going to go after a system that is failing. I mean, that will be my primary job. And I wanted to make sure that I had the support of my institution to do it. And, it turned out that recently I was critical of the institution that had hired me. I did a quick Google search of academic freedom to make sure, but this is not, I mean, They're journalists who can work at an Alden-owned newspaper. I have nothing but respect for them, and because you're talking about, at the Norristown Times, I actually just pulled some data. There was that I got from the Union, the Norristown Times Herald in Pennsylvania in 2021 had 4 staff members left. That was a 91% drop, owned by Alden Global Capital. I mean, that's just, you're talking about just a complete liquidation of these newsrooms. And, I mean, look at the Wall Street Journal cut reporters, cut reporters who covered campaign finance in an election year. And Dow Jones is not losing money. So that gets back, I think, to your earlier point about, that becomes, I think, a decision that's less about economics and more about power to me, and it becomes, again, that's a structural issue. I think, but I have nothing but respect for the reporters who are still working today. And I train reporters, and, when I train reporters, I train them in, multimedia techniques, of course, but they also are learning about the business, and they're learning, one of the guest speakers, and I teach a class, journalism capstone class on Thursday nights. And one of our guest speakers was one of my students at FAMU when I was an adjunct professor there a long, long time ago. And he was a reporter at the Messenger, so when he's going to be a guest speaker to talk about being a congressional reporter at the Messenger, and he's coming in a couple weeks, he's been laid off. So that's going to be a much different discussion in 2 weeks than it was when we planned it, in the middle of December. But these are conversations that have to be had. You have to have these conversations right now.
That's
And
precisely why we started doing this.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not having these conversations with students, you are failing students if you're not having conversations about the industry. And when I was hired at American in 2013, that was what I said in my interview. If you're not talking to students about the industry, you are leaving them with a gaping hole in their understanding of what is happening right now, because the tea leaves were there.
Again, like I said, we're past time, but whatever. Last thing, and you sort of told us this already, but we always try to ask all of our guests, when did you know that you wanted to become a journalist? Like, what was that moment for you? You did tell us a story about library cuts in Connecticut and that sparking it for you, but what was your just like, no, this is it for me. This is my calling.
Well, that's when I was 14. So I was, pretty sure I was interested then. But then I kind of thought I was going to be, I was going to write foreign policy, which when I was like 17, I'm like, oh, I'm going to write foreign policy. Like, I had any idea what does that even mean? I don't even know what that means.
That's impressive.
So, well, I still don't know what it means. Does anybody actually write foreign? I don't even, I'm still like, what does that mean? If somebody came up to me and said, oh, hi, if I met them at a party, they said I write foreign policy, I'd be like, I don't even know what that means, So I actually went to, when I was at UMass Amherst, and I became a poli-sci major. I was a poli-sci major, and I had an international relations concentration. And it was kind of wonky, kind of was, this is fine. It's not great. And I took journalism as a second major my junior year. And I started interning for the local newspaper. And I had a professor, Peter Haas. If you're out there, thank you. He's actually mentioned in my acknowledgments of my book. I adored him. I had him for international environmental policy and international economic policy. And I somehow got B's in both of those classes. I don't know how, but he was reading my stuff in the local newspaper. And basically, I used to go to his office hours and, ask him questions. He was reading my stuff in the local newspaper, and he said, you have a real gift. In in the news,
Mm-hmm.
not really in, in the international economic policy stuff. No, I mean, really, and he was right. And so when I started taking journalism classes, I took journalism as a second major, and it was as if it were, it was as if it had been made for me, and
Mm-hmm.
really it was just fell into place. And I really thank him, and as a professor now, try to help students in the same, in the same way, in a kind way that he kind of did. And actually was in Japan with my friend who was a double major poli-sci Chinese a few years later, and because she studied abroad and or actually lived abroad in Japan, and I was visiting her right after I graduated from the Columbia Journalism School, and we wrote him a postcard, I'll never forget this, from Tokyo, and said, enjoying a favorable exchange rate. He was great. He was just one of those professors that you have who just really change your life. And was it just he really did. And so that's how I ended up in journalism. And then I ended up at Columbia, and I was in the 9/11 class, and that was really, really just changed, changed everything. Just you just didn't know what the hell was going on, excuse my language. And
No, that I was working then, and
in
I
Albany or in the
Mhm.
city?
in the city. My first job was in the city at 1010 Winds to be specific.
Oh, 1010
And
wins.
oh my God, that's an experience I will never forget. Just
Yeah.
top to bottom.
It just, the whole thing is just, I feel very lucky. And I tell my students now, I feel very, very privileged and very lucky to have worked, in New York at that time, to have worked in the newsroom jobs that I had, and that people trusted me with their stories, not just on 9/11, but after. And you know, I just love talking to people. Obviously, I'm here talking to you guys, and I will talk to anybody, and I just think I love it. And I just, whether or not you've been, I just think it's such a gift to be able to share people's stories about whatever has gone on in their life, and especially the stories of, you know, of regular, whatever that means today. My parents were both blue collar, and I just think, to be able to share the stories of Americans, working, and what that means, and struggling to pay the bills some months. And, you know, I I just feel that's a real gift. And I feel like that's what journalism should do. And I feel that that's what financial journalism should do. It shouldn't tell the stories of how amazing it is that people make $125 million a year. I feel like it should tell the story of how 19, people died waiting for their pensions after the Tribune Times Mirror, deal,
Mm-hmm.
merger, bankruptcy fell apart, and people fought for years to get their pensions, and 19 of them died waiting you know, for a bunch of hedge funds to fight it out in court. That's the story to me that is not told, and might be the next story that I try to tell. Those are the stories that I think,
Well, we
we should
definitely
tell.
look forward to it. On behalf of your being willing to speak to anybody, these two anybody's are very grateful for your time, Marco. So
Thank
thank
you.
you seriously. Thank you
And
so
thank you for your
much.
work.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you.
Absolutely. All right, so that was obviously a lot to digest. I mean, there's so many different ways that you don't fully realize or maybe appreciate how much outside influence money and people who again don't really have a vested interest in journalism, they're just there to make money, are changing the way that we consume news or don't get to consume news as more and more local newspapers disappear because people are like, it's not as profitable as I thought it would be. Or, journalism is way too expensive, which, in all fairness, it is very expensive to support.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, also sort of showing people exactly what is going on in these rooms because, listen, a lot of people aren't not even aware of these companies, these hedge funds and these private equity firms, or that they own that they own your newspaper and treat it just as that, a business. And it is, but journalism is also more than that.
Yeah.
So, and you actually had some um, interesting insights into this in terms of like some companies that are kind of some upcoming or new companies that are newsrooms that are sort of popping up
I
trying
would say
to.
more like organizations or something, but yeah, so this starting off for our spotlight section, I came across an article in the Guardian, specifically I want to make sure include by Lauren Metchling, I think. And anyway, the article is journalism is in free fall, but these writers aren't giving up. Quote, we can go out swinging. And basically, the article talks about with layoffs ramping up across the media industry, reporters are trying a new model, cooperative newsrooms of their own. And this article goes through several. One of the ones that it highlights is a cooperative newsroom called Flaming Hydra. I know that sounds like a weird name, but it is. Um, and described by the organizer, Maria Bastillos, I believe is her name, is that Flaming Hydra isn't anyone's permanent livelihood yet, but she hopes that it can be, which I think for a lot of us who are trying stuff, i.e., you and me, Dom, we're hoping for that. Anyway, so just to give you a quick background on Flaming Hydra. So in 2019, a small group of independent publishers got together and they formed a cooperative called Brick House. And after 3 years of publishing at Brick House, they decided to invest their combined knowledge and resources and create the more ambitious cooperative Flaming Hydra. Flaming Hydra's got 60 members who contribute a minimum of one original piece every month to a daily newsletter, and they get equal share of the subscription proceeds, which are paid out every month. And also, more importantly, the members retain exclusive rights to their work, which is also very, very important. And yeah, if you subscribe, you get articles, essays, comics, criticism, humor, literature, photos, reviews, and a surprise. Not quite sure what that is, but each weekday. So that's one of their um, things to entice people to subscribe to them. But it's not just Flaming Hydra. There's also another group called Outlier Media. Outlier Media is a nonprofit newsroom that was designed to center Detroit, Michigan, and they're working to fill the information gaps and systemic failures that create harm in the community. And even though it doesn't specifically say we're talking about Detroit, Michigan, I'm going to go ahead and say this is the Black community where a lot of a combination of information gaps have created some serious systemic failures. Anyway, they are hoping to create a model for anybody else who wants to democratize information and redistribute power. And of course, their goal is to be a liberated city with a healthy civic infrastructure for all Detroiters. And I think that's incredibly noble. Then there's the Pivot Fund. The Pivot Fund is a new philanthropy venture that's investing $500 million into independent
Wow.
BIPOC led community newsrooms. Um, they do training, capacity building, and provide opportunities for collaborative journalism. So that's really huge. Then there's something called Proof News. Proof News is a nonprofit news studio that conducts investigations, collects public data, collaborates with journalists, researchers, and influencers around the globe, and it promotes best practices in evidence gathering, which basically means that they use something similar to the scientific method. And their approach to investigations, they develop a hypothesis and then collect and analyze the data that would or would not support that. And here's what I found most interesting: they're transparent with their findings and the limitations of their work, and they present it in something they're calling an ingredients label. And I thought that was pretty revolutionary because, in my experience, um, especially when it comes to the limitations of findings, that just gets left out. You don't need to know about that. So, Proof News is making it a point to be clear and transparent with their information. Then there's quite a few of these because a lot of people are really trying to fight back with this. There's something called the Flyover. The Flyover is a roundup newsletter that will email you quality news on everything from politics, sports, markets, scientific advances, etc. And they'll do a summary of each article for you. And basically, all you have to do is sign up and subscribe to get a copy of the Flyover. And then, because of course we are in the New York City area, there's Hellgate. Hellgate is a subscriber funded, worker owned news outlet about New York City, which of course is named for the city's sturdiest bridge over one of its most treacherous currents. Anyway, the point is that the goal is to be trenchant, playful, outraged, irreverent, and useful to readers, deeply skeptical of power, but stubbornly idealistic. And that's something that I think is also kind of revolutionary for an approach to news. So the journalists, they own the website and they're building on a movement of other worker known news outlets. And there's also Defector Media, Discourse Blog, Racket, and the Colorado Sun, all of which I haven't done bold explanations on, but we will include links to them in the show notes. And you can subscribe to them as well. They believe in a potential model for sustainable journalism that is for the journalists themselves to answer to the readers. And so I just am so inspired by all of these, seeing how people are saying, okay, there is a problem. Clearly, the answer is not going to come from the top down. So we here who are actually making the content, who are doing the journalism, let's see if we can come up with a solution. And that's super inspiring to me.
Yeah, I think that's great. The only thing I get concerned with is how you stand out and how sustainable these are. Because as we see in every market, it's once you start flooding a lot, you have all these different organizations out there. It becomes that's why it's like spotlighting these are really important so people know they exist.
Hmm.
Because once it's just like people finding our podcast is important. You have to try to break through and make sure people, hear about you and know that you're around. And I think that's great. And hopefully,
Absolutely.
it changes the at least for some of these, it changes the whole way of being able to be a sustainable, you know, company. So that's
Yeah.
awesome.
All right. Well, onward we go. I believe we can preview next week's episode.
Yes.
Dom, do you want to do that?
Yeah. So next week we're going to be talking about journalism and democracy, and capitalism, and in terms of the journalism
The oh
industry.
so light subjects of.
So yeah, so next week, Jenna, we joining us will be Victor Picard. He is professor of media policy and political economy at University of Pennsylvania and the author of Democracy Without Journalism: Confronting the Misinformation Society. We're going to be talking about can you separate journalism and uh and can you separate or is it can we separate journalism and capitalism? Trying to spit that all out there and looking at how that model is it sustainable? What needs to be changed? It'll be a really interesting conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, stick with us and we'll be back next week.
Bye, everyone.
Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Dominic Camia and Jenna Flanagan. Music provided by Jay Cowett. Research by Lori Rothenbucker. Reach out to us anytime at laidofandlookingpod@gmail.com. New episodes drop every Friday at noon.